Okay, well, good morning all. It's great to have you here for this session, which is going to be run by Dr. Simon Obendorf. He's going to talk to us about the decolonisation of higher education. I'm going to pass straight over to Dr. Obendorf so that we can ensure that we make the most of the next 30 minutes with him. So we really hope that you enjoy the session. Just a reminder that there's a Q&A tab on the screen, so please do feel free to put any questions in the Q&A and they'll be picked up as we move through the session. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Joe. And Emily, if I could have the slides, please, that would be fantastic. Hello, everyone. My name is Simon Obendorf, and just a little bit about myself before we begin. I grew up in Lutruwita on the land of the Palawa people, and I was educated in Naarm on the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung and Wiradjuri people. And I currently live and work in Lindum, Colonia. And if you're a bit confused about all of that, then it kind of points to what I want to talk to you about today, which is just how far colonialism and the kind of the thought structures, the languages, even the labels we give to things has spread throughout the world. So to give a translation of what I just said, I grew up in Tasmania and I was educated in Melbourne, Australia, and I currently live and work in Lincoln, Lindum Colonium, the kind of outpost of the Roman Empire. So I have a personal experience that kind of stretches from the extreme of one empire, the British, to the extreme of another, the Roman. And I want to talk to you today about exactly that. What it's meant that ideas, concepts, modes of thinking, ways of doing knowledge, and perhaps for this audience, ways of conceptualizing and thinking about a career have been universalized or kind of spread around the world due to the fact that people from here in Europe, largely Western Europe, went out and planted their flags, their ideas, their ideologies, their religions, but their ways of thinking and doing, and that included their universities all around the globe. I went to a university down in Australia that liked to think of itself as the Oxford of the South, that literally saw copying colonial models as a way of, boosting up its prestige, its presentation, its idea of itself. And we're only just at the start of a journey, I think, at thinking through how we might begin to deal with that legacy. And that's really come to us through this new focus on what we're calling decolonisation in higher education. And really, unfortunately, I think this is a debate that's tended to generate more noise than it has, light or compassion. You can think about the sorts of things that you're likely to see in the newspapers today. Woke professors pushing left-wing agendas, decolonizing things, throwing out the canon, changing the way we do things. And on the other side of that debate, a real sense that maybe there's a need for radical, even revolutionary change. The sorts of things that have come to us from the Black Lives Matter movement or Roads Must Fall. Now, I teach at a post-92 institution here in the East Midlands in Lincoln, and we're at the start of a project in thinking about how we begin to decolonise our institution, but already we're running into this sort of controversy. We're thinking about, how we tell the story of who we are. Now, like a lot of universities, we've renamed various buildings around our campus after great luminaries of our city's past. One of those was Alfred Tennyson. So we've named a big building after Alfred Tennyson. And a few years back, we put a tiny, about an A3 size little plaque just inside the door that talked about some of Tennyson's views around race and his connection to ideologies of European, in this case, British colonialism. And the pushback we had was loud and it was immediate. After we ran a very small kind of walking tour for new students during Welcome Week, pointing out some of this history, we got lambasted in the Daily Mail as you know, Lincoln University chiefs blasted for branding poet Alfred Lord Tennyson a problematic imperialist, with one anonymous member of staff going as far as to say that we were obviously likely to rename some of our buildings after Greta Thunberg or other kind of great luminaries of the left. Now, I'm really glad to say that despite having been singled out in the Daily Mail, this hasn't shifted our institutional commitment to decolonisation. But I tell that story because I think it helps us to contextualise the debates that are going on. There's a lot of misconception. And what I want to do in today's section is to really put to bed some of those myths and to start to talk a little bit about some of the contexts for decoloniality or decolonising work in HE today. So please, as I go through, if you have questions, do pop them in the chat or in the Q&A function there, and I'll try and leave some time at the end for us to wrap up with questions there. So, I think there are some really common myths surrounding decolonising work. Like I say, there's a lot of noise, there's not a lot of fact. There's also increasingly a lot of quite politicised misrepresentation of this work. So there's a few things that I kind of want to get out of the way before we get started. The first one of those is that decolonisation is already over. That with the transition of former colonies, say in places like Africa or Asia or Latin America, to independent nationhood, that's kind of a great moment of decolonisation. Well, yes, it's part of the story, but obviously those places are still experiencing, they're still living in the legacy and in the aftermath of their kind of colonial inheritance. You know, they may have gained their independence, a new flag may have gone up a flagpole, but institutions, languages, ways of thinking, ways of being in the world, all of that has been systematically disrupted by the colonial experience. So that's the first myth I kind of want to set to one side. The second myth is that decolonisation is just about race, and that this is, to some extent, a kind of an intellectual inheritor of, the Black Lives Matter movement, or of a kind of anti-racist work. Certainly, an awareness of race is a huge, significant part of what we do in decolonisation work. But colonialism brought more with it than just an idea about racial hierarchies. It changed the way we think about things like gender or sexuality. It changed the way we think about things like knowledge. It altered people's relationship with language, with religion. And it also gave us institutions, modes of government, modes of economics, modes of dealing with and evaluating knowledge, and above all, perhaps, the model of the European university, which, a bit like my Oxford of the South alma mater, are now replicated all the way around the world. And within those universities, of course, we have modes of thinking about work, modes of thinking about careers, of thinking about measuring excellence, of judging performance, and of kind of thinking about the sorts of people that best fit within a university as a kind of a colonial artifact, this kind of institution that is now in its global form very, very much shaped by a colonial inheritance. The next thing I want to think about is how we might start to decolonize. And I think, perhaps rightly, a lot of the focus has been on curriculum. It's been about what we teach, a little bit about how we teach. But one of the things, and that's why I'm really thrilled to talk to this group today, is I want us to start thinking about the broader work of the university. That where does decolonisation fit in things not just like curriculum or pedagogy, but in things like human resources, in institutional value sets, in things like how we manage our estates, maybe even things like our catering. How does it feed into our governance structures? All those sorts of issues. And I think there's a much broader piece of work that's able to be done there. And then really quickly to kind of, round up my myths, there's this kind of sense that this might make sense in history, but, what's it got to do with, say, medicine? And again, I would really push back on that. To give you an example, there's some really fantastic work being done around the medical curriculum at the moment about dermatology, whereas a lot of medical schools here in the UK have historically taught dermatology using examples from white skin. What does a rash look like on white skin? But we're not so good at giving people the tools to say, what does that rash look like on black skin? What does it look like on someone of Southern Asian ethnicity? So again, just starting our debate around where we start to pitch some of that work, I think is really interesting. Thinking about the history of mathematics in the Islamic world, there's lots of scope for reimagining how we think decolonization can contribute across all of our disciplines. And then there's the politicization agenda, that this is risky, that this is kind of too big a kind of concern for a lot of universities, or that the risks might outweigh the benefits. What I hope to do today is to kind of start a conversation in the sorts of HR professionals that are in this room, which say there are real, concrete, tangible business cases for embedding decolonization in the sorts of work that I know you do across your institutions. It was really interesting that a lot of institutions are now kind of thinking about decoloniality in those terms. So I want to really kind of quickly highlight some ideas about the kind of the intellectual work we're doing in decolonial studies, and then give you some kind of vignettes of how this might play into kind of three main areas of work across our universities. So that's teaching and curriculum, research, and people, performance and culture, or human resources. To understand what decoloniality or decolonizing is, I think it helps to have a kind of a thumbnail sketch around kind of what coloniality is. And I love this quote from the South African academic Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni. And Sabelo talks about how coloniality is an invisible power structure, and that it keeps those sorts of colonial relations of exploitation and domination, it keeps them alive, it sustains them long after the end of direct colonialism. So for Sabelo's work, South Africa might have officially gained its independence and kind of re-emerged from the apartheid era, but many of the structures that continued to shape the experience of Black South Africans, queer South Africans, South Africans of minoritized backgrounds around sexuality or gender or class, all of that still has a really strong colonial legacy to it. So we're up against the kind of almost this invisible, this taken for granted idea of coloniality. What can decoloniality offer us? And I think it can offer us three things. And I'm not going to go into the kind of huge detail of the quotes on the slide here, but I think it can reveal that coloniality. It could show us where that coloniality is within our institutions and within our day-to-day lives. It can then serve to challenge, to say, well, is that something we want to accept? I'm not saying that everything that kind of we do in a university needs to be kind of thrown out or radically reconfigured. But I think we do need to have a really knowing relationship with what aspects of our heritage we want to keep, what aspects we want to have a more nuanced relationship with, and perhaps what aspects of that legacy or inheritance we might want to challenge or to transform. And that leads us to my kind of third chunk there, that decoloniality, I think in its most effective form, is a building exercise. It's an addition to what we do. It's a way of enhancing and adding value. I spoke before about there being a business case for decoloniality, that this is a way of kind of us pushing forward a narrative, a way of kind of doing things that enhances the work of our institutions across kind of all aspects of our work. And so this is, I think, where the most interesting work is being done around decolonizing the university. And I think it's really interesting that it's not being necessarily British universities or universities in the developed majority white world that have done this work. This has come to us from universities in places like Southern Africa, in institutions in Latin America. Really, we're a bit late to this journey, but I think we can really learn from this and grow through it. So again, and I know you're going to have access to these slides after the session, so I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, but this is a quote from a really, really great book by a group of British academics called Decolonizing the University. And I do recommend, if you're interested in the subject, to have a think about, some of these kind of, I suppose, some of the themes that are developed here. Because I think what Gurminder Bramra, Dalia Jabral, and Kiram Nishanaglu do here is that they really point to the way in which coloniality has become embedded within the contemporary university, and perhaps the contemporary British university more than most. So they say it's difficult to turn away from the university as a site through which colonialism and colonial knowledge has been produced, consecrated, institutionalized, and naturalized. That we're almost kind of machines that are designed out of colonialism. And one of the things we reproduce is a very particular form of knowledge, or a very particular way of doing things, or a particular type of institutional structure. We divide knowledge up into discrete, schools, departments, faculties, colleges. We produce particular outputs, which we give, infinitely bureaucratic and Byzantine forms of rankings to, 2, 3, and 4-star outputs. We measure and metricize everything. We evaluate each other, our outputs, our citations, our commitments, our, the way in which we work. All of this becomes filtered through an institution which is increasingly, I think, being identified as, only one way we could do knowledge. This is one way in which knowledge could be organized. Is it necessarily the best way? And in a world where the vast majority of the planet wasn't a colonial power, was colonized rather than was a colonizer, is it the best fit for a knowledge system in the 21st century? And I think that's where we perhaps need to be kind of pushing ourselves forward. As the authors here say, despite the formal empires falling, not much changed within Western universities. And so I think there's a real push for us. I think there's a real opportunity for us to make the case for starting to bring some of this work into dialogue with what we're doing in human resources and in the university much more broadly. So I said before, the most effective way of doing this is to try and almost anticipate some of that controversy and pushback I spoke about at the beginning of the session. I've been really concerned with the work I've been doing here at Lincoln, but I've also worked on this in universities in Southeast Asia and back in Australia, is to situate decoloniality as something that's an addition. I don't think we win many converts to the cause. I don't think we do, any kind of justice to the potential contribution that decoloniality can make by presenting it as this kind of very angsty, guilt-ridden, sensorial, you've got to change everything, you've got to feel guilty about where we've come from, you've got to feel, very negative about the sorts of institutions you inhabit, but rather say there's a real opportunity here to add value. And I've just kind of put some ideas on this slide around where I think that value can lie. Firstly, I think we live in a diverse, plural, globalized, world of cultures, societies, economies, that all of a sudden we are encountering difference on our campuses, in our workforces, in the sorts of knowledge and the sorts of, contexts and, derivations of knowledge that we work with in universities. So being aware of colonial legacies, I think, can really help in that adding richness, adding diversity work. I think at its best, it should be a supportive project, that it should involve, people with skills in this area and perhaps people from, affected communities, but also people, like myself, who are kind of beneficiaries of a lot of, colonial thinking and privilege, working to support colleagues in that process of engaging with some of this work. And I think that's going to have dividends, in terms of student experience, in terms of research, but I think it's also going to have dividends in terms of institutional values and culture, making people feel seen, making people feel a part of, making people feel understood and reflected in the institutions that they join. We now recruit from across the planet. One of the things we need to be thinking about is not just kind of getting different types of people from different backgrounds here, but actually how do we learn from their experiences? How do we learn from their approaches to knowledge once we get them here? And that's where I think the work that I know a relatively small number of universities are doing now in professional services is really exciting. That it's around thinking about how some of the structures we've built for ourselves might work to benefit certain types of knowledge and not others. So that's about, thinking about how we define things like research excellence or internationalization, or even things like measuring performance or supporting staff to, be onboarded and through organizational development projects. And I think there you start to see some of how we're going to challenge that kind of challenging and kind of identifying role of decoloniality, but you're also seeing the building role of decoloniality. It's adding value into what we do. And I think there's some really key connections here to a lot of what I know a lot of your institutions will be doing around EDI work, around internationalization, around widening participation, and also, I suppose, also around institutional values and culture sets. So I said I'd give you some quick examples of how this might work. And again, we can pick up this in some of the questions you might have. Perhaps the most obvious place this is occurring in universities is curriculum and pedagogy. I think this helps us with, telling new types of stories, presenting our disciplines in new ways to students. I think it also helps in kind of countering some of the ethnocentrism of what we do. I've put on the slide there, this was actually one of my textbooks. My background is as an international relations scholar. This is one of my textbooks, and this is all you needed to know about international relations according to this book, was from Plato to NATO. So from Western civilization to the Western Euro-Atlantic, you kind of left out 2/3 of the entire world. So I think there's some real scope here for us to consider how we teach, what we teach, and the groups of people we're teaching to. How are we learning with our students? How are we doing co-creation? How are we kind of presenting different types of ideas to our students? One of the ways we've thought about this at Lincoln is through not kind of doing a tick box approach to kind of all decolonial all the time in every module, but to rather think about this in terms of graduate attributes and outcomes. And one of the things we've talked about is how we'd like at the end of our programs for every student to have a critical awareness of the consequences of colonialism, but also how those consequences have shaped their academic discipline, but also their career pathways. So you're starting to see there almost that through train to thinking through preparing students for the world of work, but also, given that a lot of our students go on to work in our institutions, preparing them for institutions that are also in the process of being decolonized. The second area we could think about, and I can really only give kind of broad sketches at this stage, is how we might decolonize our research practice. And here I think it's really important for us to start to own some of our privileges as researchers from the Western world, how we start to build awareness of that privilege into things like our research design, our methodology, our ethics processes, tripping over my words there, and also how we think about, designing and communicating research? Is our research extractive? Is it kind of something we go out to the field, which is empty until someone from this part of the world goes out and plows it and gives it, extracts value and knowledge from it, and then brings it back here to the UK and turns it into a knowledge product to benefit a university's ref statement and an individual researcher's career? So starting to think about how we might do co-creation, how we might do collaborative work, I think is really important there. And then perhaps most obviously for this audience, how do we decolonize our professional services? Here at Lincoln, we're in the stage of moving from having a formal Department of Human Resources to having what we call a Department of People, Performance and Culture. And we've really taken the decision to situate decolonial work within the kind of the institutional value set or the institutional ideas of the institution. So again, the kind of the classic stereotype of the Western academic, pale, stale, male, and Yale. And to what extent are our institutions designed for someone who comes from an elite, research-intensive, PhD program, is probably white, is probably older, is probably cisgendered male? To what extent might we start to break down some of those assumptions and think, well, might we design our processes, our academic hospitality as an institution to engage different types of people? So I've put some ideas there. How do we better attract, support, manage, and retain talent? And I think that means having a much broader concept of how we measure and evaluate talent. I think, how do we manage performance? How do we look at, how we assess performance? How do we support people to perform within a very colonialist, very Western university structure? And I think some of that's going to be about questioning some of the biases and assumptions that we have here in Western professional services in higher education. How do we build this into our institutional cultures? And perhaps, and I go backwards and forwards on this last one, but to what extent do we want to build this into policy and procedures? I think there's the colonial disease of British higher education is that the solution to everything is either a new committee, a new policy, or a new form. And yes, I think there's places for all of those, but I think if we are going to have longer lasting change in this area, one way in which we can start to center that and ensure that it's longer lasting is by thinking about culture and values alongside policy and procedure. It's certainly something we've talked a lot about here in Lincoln, about that kind of balance between value sets, having people thinking about this stuff as they go through, rather than kind of being forced into a fairly typical UK Equalities Act EDI driven let's kind of do a tick box approach. So just to finish up, and then I'd love to take some questions and hear your thoughts. I think it's really easy to kind of assume that decoloniality is just the same as EDI work. And I'd really encourage you to think differently there. I think EDI work is incredibly important in kind of getting different types of representation and getting different types of individuals and experiences into institutions. But I also think we've got to think about what is the shape, what are the assumptions, what are the values of that institution once they get here. There's a great quote from an Indigenous American academic, Professor Blackfoot, who talks about you can put a black person into a broken institution. That won't fix the broken institution. It will just break the black person. Putting the assumption or the kind of the burden of doing this work on people from affected communities, I think is a real problem, one we need to kind of think about how we manage. I would really encourage you to take this away and talk about this in your teams, because I don't think this is something that should just engage academics. One of the great things that I've learned from this project is working with professional services staff around this stuff. If a university is a community, people like you are the people who have an enormous say over not just who gets to be a part of that community through processes of recruitment and onboarding, but also the value set and the kind of the way in which that community operates through things like organizational development, through things like the processes, the onboarding, all the stuff that I know you do. But I'd also think about, how we do this, broadening it beyond the question of race, making it something that's positive and additive, not subtractive or guilt-ridden. And I'd also say, look, this is not something that I think we're going to arrive at. I think we're going to be on a decolonizing journey for quite a while. This is not necessarily a fixed destination, but something we're going to have to need to keep thinking about as we go through. So have a think about some of these kind of themes. How do we best educate our communities? How do we communicate the work we do? Where does decolonial work best belong? Is this within existing departments working on EDI or race? Is this within a separate decolonizing team? Is this within a kind of a broader institutional kind of values model? Being courageous about what we believe in. And I think that's, to an extent, does involve standing up to the Daily Mails who try and drag down this work. Being aware of context. I'm very aware that the work I do as decolonial lead at a post-92 majority white institution in the whitest county in England and the most Eurosceptic county in England is very different than how this might look, say, in SOAS or the LSE or Oxford or Cambridge. And I think there it is also about acknowledging that there are debates here, that there are legitimate intersections between this work and, say, things like academic freedom or free speech policies, or around freedom of expression, or around how we kind of get people on board with some of these debates. I'm just going to leave you, and I'll leave it on the slide, and then I'll really open up to questions. This is. And it took 2 years of negotiating and debate to get to this point. But this is the statement we had agreed in our institution around what we thought decolonizing our university might mean. And one of the things, I'll leave it there for you to read, but one of the things I really like about this definition is that it's not just about curriculum and it's not just about race. This is about scholarship, interpersonal relations, teaching, learning, and professional practice. And it's also about all sorts of the harms, the legacies related to coloniality and racism. And that's an ongoing process of reconsideration and reconstruction. It's a long journey. It's one I hope you'll join those of us working in this field on, but that's more than enough from me, and I'll take it over to you. And I see there's already a Q&A. And Jenny, you've asked whether I've published it all on this topic. This is something I'm just in the process of working through, and we're kind of putting together a piece for the SAGE handbook on decolonizing. I'm trying to remember the title. It's a new SAGE handbook. I think it's on decolonizing curriculum and pedagogy. But we're trying to kind of say we need to be thinking much broader than curriculum and pedagogy. There's also, if you're interested, Jenny, I'm happy to follow up with this afterwards, is around some work I just presented at the Journeys of Decolonizing conference at De Montfort University. So I'm more than happy. Thoughts on speaking to students about decolonization? I think that's a really interesting question. I think it largely depends on the type of student. I will have in my classes students from many parts of the formerly colonized world who will have some instinctive understanding of some of this. I will have predominantly, maybe first generation to university white British students who have been through the kind of shamefully neglectful British education system, which really doesn't give them a grounding on the history of empire, who you need to really contextualize this for. One of the things I would say is start to think about the entry point to your disciplines. All of our disciplines have a history. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter whether your discipline deals with the topic of coloniality, it will have a history that's bound up with the ideas of coloniality. So why do we teach mathematics the way we do? Why do we teach physiology the way we do? Why do we teach anatomy with the way they do? So I think those entry points are a really useful place to start thinking around ideas of decolonization. And now I've got a deliberately loaded question. I love these. This is really just a problem for older, more global universities. And look, I think you're absolutely right with that tension between different types of universities. That's why I said be really aware of context when you do some of this work. I think Roads Must Fall has resonance in an Oxford where students walk past Oriel and there's Rhodes literally carved into the stone and celebrated in a Rhodes scholarship on an annual basis as a marker of elite academic excellence. That doesn't mean as much in an institution like Lincoln or a lot of post 92 institutions. I think how we do that is reflected in our decision here to make this much more about institutional values than it has been to necessarily situate this as anti-racist work. I think this is about also saying that we might be a post-92 university, but we've still chosen to call ourselves a university. We've still chosen to shape ourselves with a very traditional set of structures and to inhabit our HR environment with a fairly consistent set of policies that are very reflective of particular ways of thinking about careers, excellence, performance, knowledge. So I think we have to do more work perhaps to contextualize that. We also don't have the push from students. We don't have that kind of push from below in many cases. I think that's changing. And I think the internationalization agenda is perhaps shifting that. As we're seeing many more students on our campuses from India, Nigeria, Pakistan, places across the formerly colonized world and the formerly British colonized world, we're starting to see empire coming home to British institutions in some key ways. And I think it's still early days in that process. It'd be interesting to see how some visa changes and the kind of the broader regulatory environment impacts that. But I think there's real capacity, and probably in terms of making that business case for decoloniality, I think there's perhaps more urgency now that we're responding to different types of student populations and demographics. Any other questions? I think we might have done it, Jo.
Okay. Thanks so much, Simon. That was a really fascinating session. I think you've left us with just so much to think about, really, and thinking about where you might start with all of that. But it's such an important.
And please don't think you've got to do all of this at once. I think that's a really important point. One of the things, and I work very heavily with the senior team in people, performance, and culture here at Lincoln. And one of the things we've had to thought about is, if you look at the whole breadth of work that, say, an HR department does, we've kind of cherry picked a few things that we're kind of starting with, and then we'll kind of build on that. So we've looked at things like our performance management policy. We've looked at things like our recruitment process, and said, okay, we'd love to do a piece of work on promotions, but let's get recruitment, sorted. And then once we've got that experience, and we've also got a group of people who know within the team what the parameters of the debate are, how we move that forward. So I know it can kind of feel like here's this academics kind of plonking all this work down on professional services stuff, and use your academics. Jo and I were talking before the session about this kind of quite toxic split between professional services and academic staff in a lot of institutions. And I think one of the things I've really valued, and again, it's about breaking down some of those artificial, very colonially inspired boundaries, is working, reaching across, that this might be my research area of expertise, but I can work from and learn enormously from colleagues, like people in this room who have done so much to kind of, define the institutions that we all live in. So you're really important, and we need people like you, and let's work together.
Absolutely, and I think probably a lot of us can relate to that split and trying to kind of break down those barriers. But yeah, thank you so much for the session. It was a really brilliant session. Just a reminder to everyone in this session that there's a panel session directly afterwards, which we hope you can join. So thanks again, Simon. Thanks for the questions, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.